So an idea that I thought I had covered previously turns out to have not been covered. And in a topic that I think is pretty interesting, I'd like to cover it. But with a twist, as you know me to do. Rules as intended versus rules as written. Now, I know I've talked about this in several videos, in particular homebrew videos and homebrew review videos, but I don't think I've ever made a specific video about the rules as intended versus rules as written dichotomy ever. Now, for those of you who are unaware, which if you play tabletop role-playing games, it's unlikely that you are unaware of these terms, but rules as written versus rules as intended is the difference in how rules are perceived. So if a rule is stated to do something, and that is how it is written, and that is how you run it, you are playing it rules as written. Now, if a rule exists that tells you something, and you can look at the rule and you can make several interpretations as to how the rule is meant to be used, but you take what you perceive to be the most logical conclusion as anything else, while it makes sense, would make things far too unbalanced, would break the game in some way, or what have you, you are playing things as rules as intended. Or, if the creators of the game come out and directly state that the way that it is written is different than how it is intended and that it was a mistake or what have you. Basically, if there's rules clarifications by the creators, then it's rules as intended. Why is this important? Well, in a lot of instances, rules as written is rules as intended. In a vast majority of situations, rules as written is how they are meant to be interpreted and how they're meant to be run. However, there are instances in a lot of games that have a rule written, and then when it is written, it is able to be interpreted multiple different ways, and then that's when the clarification comes in. So why is this important? Why is knowing the difference important? Well, you know me to be a homebrew person. So when it comes to homebrew in particular, knowing what you are writing in terms of how you intend for it to be understood down to the minutia, I think is more important than clean wording. What do I mean by this? Well, let's take an example. Let's say you are, for some reason, playing 5th edition, and you want to add something to, let's say, a martial, because that's what we do here. And it has the effect of whenever you make a melee weapon attack, using a weapon you are wielding, it does XYZ. Let's say that. Now, to me and you, that makes perfect sense. You make a melee weapon attack. However, if the rules surrounding the new option imply that you are meant to be using particular weapons, so for example, if this particular option is surrounded by wording that suggests that you're only supposed to be able to use this effect while using, say, short swords, long swords, scimitars, stuff like that, any bladed weapon, but the effect itself does not state it has to be with a bladed weapon, that is a conflict of rules, because they are reading it as the effect that it is a part of is intended, but the effect itself does not make the stipulation. So people tend to make the assumption that because the effect itself does not have that restriction placed on it, the restrictions applied to the overall does not apply. So for example, if the thing that you are creating is a maneuver And the maneuver requires you to have a short sword or a long sword, but the effect just says make a melee weapon attack with a weapon you are wielding, but does not specify it has to be with a short sword or long sword. Some people will take that as, well, the short sword and long sword restriction means that I have to have a short sword or a long sword on my person in order to have this maneuver, but I can use it with anything. Even if you were intending it to be with a short sword or long sword, that is how some people will interpret it. However, the way that you have to kind of word things in different systems is obviously different. But what I've found is that when in doubt, word it out. And what I mean by this is that if there is a particular thing that you are creating for a system, or you're creating a system as a whole, and you have a mechanic that is meant to be for a particular form of support, such as for swords or axes or what have you, and you, in the effect, do not specify that it is only meant for that, then what you can do is you can have a really lengthy explanation inside of it to explain that it has this restriction, to absolutely make sure you have no gaps in the armor, no plot holes, nothing. So, for example, if this maneuver requires, in order to take the maneuver, it requires you to have a short sword or long sword, but the maneuver is worded as dealing with all melee weapon attacks, what you can do instead is state, when you make a melee weapon attack using a short sword or long sword that you are wielding, you do XYZ. Is this more wordy and a lot less clean and kind of a, well, no duh moment if anybody with a functioning brain is able to put two and two together? Yes. But is it sometimes necessary to get that point across? Also, yes. It is unfortunate that that's how it is, but if it comes down to it later that the wording becomes an issue, I think it is better to have it over-explained than under-explained. Because at least when it's over-explained, it's very clear what you intended for it to do, even if it's messy. But if it's under-explained, there is going to be so many interactions with people reading your brews or your systems where they're going to have questions like, well, what about X scenario or Y situation or Z position? Like, what about all these? Do these still function? And, you got to patch those. So I think if you're going to be making a system or brew for a system, I would say attempt to over-explain a situation or over-explain how you're going to do it if you are for sure certain that it's going to be misunderstood. However, I will say, if you are under the impression that your brew will not be misunderstood or your system will not be understood based around the rules or mechanics that you have built around the idea of these options being available, or if it's just for your table and you directly explain how these things are meant to work, I don't think that's necessarily a reason. I don't think that's necessarily a time that you have to overly specify when things occur, how things occur, and you don't really have to do a lot of rules clarifications for your table. But regardless, I would still urge all homebrewers and game designers to really think about rules as intended versus rules as written. Because the way you write a rule and the way you intend it to be worded, like intended to work, could become different in the eyes of different people. And so if you have any form of doubt as to how it is meant to be interpreted, there are many ways to go about it, but the easiest I found is to explain it in the effects, like in the rules, that this is how it's meant to work, and even if it doesn't work, You explain it in the individual portions that you believe are going to have those issues. And eventually, once you kind of get your feet in the sand and understand what you're doing and like where you want it to go, and your particular writing style is better found, then the overcomplication or the over sharing of clarification is no longer necessary, because it's going to be heavily implied. In fact, almost directly stating so, based around context clues, that the way you intended it is, like, the way you wrote it is how it is meant to be interpreted.